So Lounge. Today we're going to be talking about finishing seams. Now you may be thinking, but Tony, I've sewn my seam. Aren't I finished? Not exactly. Seam finishes are applications to the outside edges of the seams that you've just finished sewing. Now the reason you would do this is to keep the seam from raveling during wash and wear, keep those little edges from fraying, and it will also create more stability in your actually sewn seam to prevent your garment from falling apart, and it gives your garment a more professional look. So today I'm going to teach you 3 different ways to finish your seams. One of them just requires a cutting tool, so it's super easy, and the other 2 are basic ways you can finish your seams without any fancy presser feed or stitches. Let's get started. The first seam finish method is based on cutting. That means you need pinking shears, which are these funky kind of scissors that have a zigzag cutting blade. Or if you don't have pinking shears, you can get a pinking blade for your rotary cutter. And it's this roughly kind of blade, and it's going to make the same zigzag kind of pattern that the scissors make. So grab the tool that you've got handy and let's keep going. This is my sample seam, which is just some quilting cotton. I have sewn a straight stitch down one side at 5/8 of an inch, which is the standard commercial seam allowance, and then I press the seam open. Now we're going to take the pinking shears first, and I'm going to fold the fabric back so that just the edge of the seam is exposed, and I'm going to line up the edge of the pinking shears with the edge of the fabric, and then I'm going to start cutting. And then as you move down, line up the teeth with the bottom triangle and keep going till you finish. So that is a finished pinked edge using pinking shears. We're going to use the same sample for the pinking with the rotary cutter. Now you're still going to fold your fabric back, so you just have a single layer here. And if you line it up with one of the lines on your rotary cutter mat, and you're just going to overlap the fabric a tiny bit, then you take your rotary cutter and you just line it up on the line and cut. And my blade's a little dull and I'm not cutting totally straight. Okay, I'll try that again. There we go. So you can see on that side is the rotary cutter pinked edge, and this is the pinking shears pinked edge. Using pinking shears or a pinking blade on your rotary cutter is the easiest way to finish your seams. I've been using this technique since I started sewing back in college, and it's great for lightweight and medium weight fabrics that are fairly tightly woven and don't ravel easily. Next, I'm going to show you 2 more ways to finish your seams. So let's head over to the sewing machine. The first sewn method we're going to look at today is a turn under seam finish. Basically, we're going to turn under the edge of the seam finish and sew very closely to that edge with a tighter straight stitch. Now, my usual straight stitch is at 2.5. So I'm going to make a smaller stitch and lower that down to about 1.5. To get started, you just need a sample seam, and then you're going to fold the edge under and press it. Let's go in for a closer look. This is my practice seam, and as you can see, it is folded under to one side. And just like when we pinked the seam finish, we only want to go through one layer of the seam edge. So fold your fabric off to one side, the side you're not sewing, and then line up the presser foot with the edge of the fabric. So we're sewing at about 1/8 of an inch seam, which is usually from the middle line to the inside edge of the presser foot. If you're not sure, just grab a handy ruler and measure it. Apply some pressure to the foot pedal And let's finish this seam edge. And lift that presser foot. Let's cut off those thread tails. And as you can see, it is a nice finished edge. Once you open your seam back up, you have a nice finished edge. So you want to do that on both sides of the seam ideally. And let's move on to the next type of seam finish. Our third seam finish is using a zigzag stitch. Now, as with any time you use a zigzag stitch, we're going to need to adjust the length and the width of the zigzag in order to get the right size. Before I made this video, I went through all of my vintage sewing books for any mention of seam finishes. And unfortunately, almost every single one of them said you just adjust the length and the width to what's suitable for the fabric, which is great in theory, but it's not very easy for a beginner. I finally found one book that said to do the length and the width at a medium stitch. For my Bernina, the length goes up to 5 and the width goes up to 5. So doing it a medium length, I did it 2.5 for each. So I have my machine set, and let's go in for a closer look. Just like our other seam finishes, we are only going to be sewing on the single width of fabric, and we're not sewing them together. I've watched other videos that said to do that. That's going to create a seam that's way too bulky. It's not what we're going for here. So fold your fabric back like we've done before, so you have a single layer. And this time we're going to arrange the presser foot so the fabric is kind of in the middle of the presser foot, and the outside edge on this side is going to be lined up. Let's go in for a little bit closer look. There we go. So you can see that the presser foot is along the seam line, and we have our machine set for zigzag. So let's put a little pressure on the foot pedal and get going. Hopefully you do not have a cat attack while you're doing this. Raise that presser foot. Let's go over to those tears. And as you can see, we have a nice zigzag stitch. Now you may notice that there's a little bit of a curve in it. It looks like there's a little bit of a trough. This can be evened out by taking it over to the iron and pressing it nice and hot. After sewing up the other side of the seam, I went over to the iron, gave it a quick press, and as you can see, the zigzag stitch is lying nice and flat and there's no ridge in my fabric anymore. You might think that this still looks a little bit messy with this fuzzy edge over here, and you just grab a pair of scissors and you can trim along the edge. Be careful you don't cut through your zigzag stitch or cut the lower layer of your fabric that is not actually part of the seam allowance. Now, that's much neater compared to the other side. Just complete by trimming the other side, and you've got your third type of seam finish. Now you know 3 different ways to finish your seams. Try each of them out on some samples and figure out which one you like the best. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to click like below and subscribe to my channel so you never miss a stitch. And if you've got questions but no one to answer them, head on over to Let's Talk Sewing for Beginners, hosted by So Lounge. It's an interactive Facebook group where I go live every Wednesday at 4:30 Central Standard Time. You can ask all the questions you want, and I'll do my very best to get them answered. Until we meet again, happy sewing!